Welcome, everyone. It's great to be with you, and we appreciate those that are joining us online as well for a very important discussion, one that often doesn't happen outside the Beltway. Often, when you talk about things like public lands and national monuments, to anyone east of the Mississippi, you sort of get a glazed over look of what does that really mean. People in New York typically don't know what public lands are because they don't really have any in New York. So this is a great opportunity to have a very important discussion, not only about national monuments, but also about the Antiquities Act and presidents of both political parties. This is an interesting issue. We were very pleased that Secretary Zinke and President Trump called for a review of the national monuments. It's a critical issue, and it's one that people tend to go to the extremes. We have a lot of loud voices and special interests that drive a lot of this discussion and debate, often creating more confusion than clarity. Actually happened a couple of weeks ago, got a call from a very angry woman who started yelling about the Bears Ears National Monument in Utah. And she said it was the last straw that the president was going to take over Bears Ears so he could put a golf course on top of it. And I couldn't quite figure out what she meant. I was a little confused. I tried to ask a question, but she was in full rant mode. In fact, I think she had mastered the art of circular breathing because she didn't stop for 10 minutes. She just kept going. And finally, when she'd kind of spewed out all the venom she had, I very gently and carefully asked, ma'am, where did you hear that? This only revved her up a little bit more, and she started screaming that this was the last straw. A golf course on Bears Ears is just beyond the pale. And I said, where did you read this? And she said, oh, I know this is true because I read it in the Salt Lake Tribune this morning. And so I quickly pulled up the Tribune website to see an article by Robert Gerke, who's a great writer. And underneath the headline, it said in all caps, "This is satire." And I could never quite convince the woman that this was all just an interesting a joke from her. So actually, I'm going to send a bill to Robert Gerke for an hour of my life that I'm never getting back. But it often shows that we have a confirmation bias, and often we do allow the loud and strident voices and many of the special interests to drive the narrative and the conversations. The thing I hope we come away from today, not just about current national monuments that are under review. We're very anxious and look forward to seeing what the president will do as we move forward. And this is about moving forward. The Antiquities Act is an issue that should concern all of us. It's something that started out with good intent, but has been abused by presidents of both political parties, frankly, for many, many years. And so that's going to be part of our discussion today. But the thing that I hope we come away with first and foremost is that this is not so much about land, and this is not so much about who controls what. This is about people. It's about the lives and livelihoods of those that live in these areas that often get swept away or their voices get silenced by large, loud national voices. We often say that a rich man's playground should never come at the expense of a working man's livelihood. And that's a big part. And so we're going to talk about some of those things today and hear some of the stories of those who have been impacted by some of these sweeping executive orders where, again, we're doing things with a cell phone and a pen, which is not the way the founders had intended. And so with that, we're going to move right into our program today. We're very pleased to be joined first today by someone who has really led out in this effort for many years, Congressman Rob Bishop from Utah's 1st Congressional District. He's someone who not only understands these issues and is passionate about these issues, but he's someone who really gets it, who takes the time to listen to all the voices. And to take that into account and to figure out how we can do this in a responsible way. Again, the strident voices, the loud and angry voices often keep us a safe distance from having the discussion where we can talk about how do we become careful stewards of the land. This isn't about putting oil rigs under delicate arches and moving in parking garages into the middle of a forest. This is about responsible multiple use. This is about local control and local voices. And so with that, we'd like to turn some time over to Congressman Rob Bishop.
Thank you. I am pleased to be here, especially today because last night kicked off the only time in sports that's even important. So this is God's sport. If any of you like football, screw it. Until the World Series is over, till the World Series is over, your sports do not exist. And then you can have your sport until spring training starts again. But this is it now. I am the youngest kid of the youngest kids, so there's a vast difference. And my father was a very good ball player. Um, he actually played semi-pro ball in the 1920s. Well, technically, his paycheck said he was a brakeman for a copper company in Utah, but he's actually the second baseman on their team. And he made a good living at it until he had a kid and a wife and started hurting his arm, and then had to get a real job when, ironically, the Depression hit, and it took him 20 years before he earned as much money as in his 20s playing ball for a certain company in the Industrial League in Utah. In the 1930s, he bought a new glove, and he used that all the time through the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. In fact, he was at what we call the all-church fast-pitch softball tournament, where he was announced as the oldest player playing in the game that time in the entire tournament, and proceeded to hit a single, which he stretched into a double with a head-first slide, and he was 51 at the time. That's the kind of person he was. He gave his glove to my brother, who is 16 years older than I am, who used it in the 50s. He was technically in the tank corps of the Army, but he was actually the shortstop on their team for a while. In the late 60s, I got the glove, and I was so proud. Now, fortunately, I was a catcher, so I didn't actually ever use it, because by the time I got it, it was old. I mean, the left thumb, the thumb had been misshapen. It had broken, and I was too cheap, so I actually fixed it and tied it together with shoelaces. Even softball, I had a foam in here, otherwise this would have been destroyed on every catch. And I actually learned the practice of putting my thumb or my finger out, not because it looked cool, but I just needed as much padding as is humanly possible right there. I love that glove. It was nostalgic. It was fun. It also made me lazy, because all I had to do was put my hand out. When the ball went in there, it was enveloped in the glove because it was so flimsy, it just wrapped around the ball. And about 10 years ago, my kids bought me this one for my birthday. And all of a sudden, I realized first I had to work harder at it because it wasn't as flexible as the old one was. But also, it's a much better glove, and it actually worked much better than the other one. Doesn't have the romance that the old one did, but this was much better. In many ways, the Antiquities Act is my old glove. There is nostalgia to it, and there was romance to it. It was old. It was passed in 1906. Please remember, when the Antiquities Act was first passed, there were only 45 states. There was no Park Service. There was no BLM. There were no environmental laws. So the idea of antiquity, something that needed to be protected, there had a purpose to it, just like the old glove had a purpose to it at that time. Teddy Roosevelt used it 18 times, which is a lot. He actually put aside 1.5 million acres of land, which is a lot until today. In Utah, we make a big deal about the mighty 5 national parks we have. Personally, I would like to change that to the Super 6 or maybe the Sexy 7, but there are 5 national parks in Utah, one of which started as a national monument by Teddy Roosevelt. You pick all 5 together, that's 850,000 acres. You have to realize both Bears Ears and Grand Staircase are 1 million acres more than the 5 national parks in Utah. Now, I'm sorry, I can't comprehend 1 million acres anyway. But to try and put it in some kind of context, those two parks are monuments by themselves, designated they're bigger than 68 Washington, D.C.s. They are bigger than 5 Rhode Islands put together. That's the kind of size in which we are talking about. It is true that there have been 19 presidents since the Antiquities Act was passed. 16 of them used it in some form. But one of those 16 has done 66% of all the monument lands by himself. And one of them has gone above and beyond the call of duty when it comes. They're actually putting 500, 500 million acres in monument designation, which I think exceeds Teddy Roosevelt's 1.5 million acres that he actually did. 3 of those presidents didn't use it at all. Reagan never did that act. Neither did Bush 1. Even Nixon. He finally got something right. He never used the Antiquities Act. Gerald Ford used it, and he actually put aside 84 acres of land. There were 9 of them who had less than 50,000 acres total combined of everything that they used at that particular time. So when it comes to the Antiquities Act, it is very clear there are about 4 presidents who have abused it. Unfortunately, they are 4 of the last 6 presidents we have had. And that is the problem with the Antiquities Act. What started as something noble and grand like my father's glove turned into something far different, far less, and it is time now to reform it and make it useful again. The Antiquities Act desperately needs some kind of reform because it is being abused today. Look, there are certain things the Antiquities Act was supposed to do. Number one, it was supposed to identify something and save it. Identify an antiquity. That's why it's called the Antiquities Act. A fish is not an antiquity. A tree is not an antiquity, but it has been used for that purpose. In fact, I one time asked Katie McGinty, who was helping Clinton do the Grand Staircase Escalante, what was the antiquity you tried to save in the Grand Staircase Escalante? And she said, well, there were some unique grasses out there. And I thought she was just being a smart aleck. In reality, that was the only thing they had, was a bunch of grasses out there. In fact, in one of the emails that have since come to light, she actually did say, I'm increasingly of the view that we should just drop these Utah ideas. We do not really know how the enviros will react, and I do think there is a danger of abuse of the withdrawal and antiquities authority, especially because these lands are not really endangered. And that's the second thing, the antiquities. It had to be something that was an antiquity that was endangered. And it was supposed to be the smallest footprint possible. You all know the story. When they were debating it, it was, should we cap it at 320 acres or 640 acres? And someone said, well, we may at some time need like 800 acres. So they said, okay, let's just say the smallest footprint possible. 500 million acres anywhere is not the smallest footprint possible. Doing something that's bigger than the 5 national parks in Utah by 1 million acres is not the smallest footprint possible. Doing something the size of 5 Rhode Islands is not. Barack Obama created monument areas the size of the state of Rhode Island what would be at the equivalent of every 4 days he was in office for all 8 years. They just went overboard in abusing the act. In fact, at one time we said, well, maybe we should just try and have NEPA apply to presidential nominations. So they have to go through the NEPA process, what everybody else in the country is supposed to do. And the White House became apoplectic, saying there is no way a president should ever be supposed to actually have to comply with NEPA standards. He can't do that. That is simply unfair to the President of the United States. It's fair to the rest of the nation, but not fair to the United States. And somehow there is a disconnect. That is one of the reforms that we need to have in here. So the bottom line is still, we have created a situation which no longer is the Antiquities Act used to save specific parcels of land, to save an antiquity that is threatened and needs to be preserved for the future. It is now used for political purposes, given in a got you announcement where there is no chance for anybody to actually have input. That's why I commend President Trump and Secretary Zinke for doing something that is truly unique in presidential politics. They actually decided to go out and talk to people, everybody again, and review what the very purpose of this act is supposed to be, and come up with some kind of recommendations. We are far past the time when fringe groups who have spent millions of dollars to try and blur the lines between antiquities and other areas of federal land, where elitist groups and corporate special interests on the far left have helped finance a campaign of misinformation about the act, the act's intents, the purpose of then using the media as their echo chamber to do it. We have repeatedly been misled, and the public has been led that this is somehow a conflict between conservation and energy development, as Boyd said. That's just simply not the case. That's not true. That is not the dichotomy that's out there. There is a deliberate confusion in the public about the difference between national parks and national monuments. And all of those are for a political purpose. It is time we have to reform the Antiquities Act. It is no longer being used for its intended purpose. It is no longer being used effectively. It's now being used as a political ploy, and a very cynical one at that too. So I'm sorry, it's now time for the government to finally buy a new glove. My dad's glove may be nostalgic and nice, and I'm saving it, but it ain't working anymore. We need a new glove. That's what we have to do with the Antiquities Act. Now, with that, I thought I was going to watch that to know when my time was up, and I didn't see when I started. So I don't know how far I have bored you. If there are any questions, I'd be willing to do that. Otherwise, if you'd like to get on to the real stuff of the day, that would be wise as well. Okay. With that, thank you for doing it, and I appreciate both Heritage and Sutherland for going on with this topic. It's important stuff. We need to do it. So it's all yours. Thank you, Boyd.
Thanks, Congressman. We've got Senator Lee is just on his way over. He'll be here shortly. Maybe what we'll do in the interest of keeping our flow going, if we can have our engineer back there. One of the things that we've done at Sutherland Institute is to really help raise the voices of those who actually live in the area. Oh, it's not ready. That's what I was thinking, but that's what I get for thinking. That's what my staff tells me regularly. All right. So we'll hold on for just a moment until Senator Lee comes in, and we'll give him an opportunity to share some thoughts. He's just walking over right now, so he'll be here very shortly. A couple of things just to keep in mind as we go through the day. We will have the opportunity both to hear from some of those impacted by the national monuments from various areas, not just from out west. We've got some visitors today from the Northeast, those in the fishing industries who have also been impacted by the Antiquities Act and some of these national monument designations. As I was saying earlier, part of what we have to make sure we're doing as citizens is to make sure we are getting past the kind of the top level information that is out there, because often that is what is confusing the issues. And again, I don't think this is something that is so much of a left versus right issue. Often this is more an up-down, inside-outside issue. And often what you have is those inside the Beltway here in D.C. and those who are outside who actually live out in these rural counties. We've seen a lot of devastation in Utah with the counties under Grand Staircase Escalante, where, again, promises are made when the Antiquities Act is deployed. In Grand Staircase, there was a promise that the grazing would continue at his historic levels. It is now down 33% from where it was when the monument was designated almost 20 years ago. And so those are the things that we often have to look at. The other thing we need to make sure we're recognizing and understanding is the great uncertainty that the Antiquities Act brings. We have to remember that anything that is executed by executive order can also be undone by executive order. And the certainty and the stability for local residents is so critical. If they are uncertain if something is going to stand or if the rules are going to be changed, that's devastating to many of these local economies. In Utah, in particular, we have some counties that are nearly 94% federal land, so there's no tax base. There's no way for them to really survive and thrive, and so we're seeing that devastation. So again, remember, this is not just about a land issue. This is a people issue. This is a community issue, and many of these communities are suffering and struggling because of these sweeping things that Congressman Bishop shared with us this morning. So we will have an opportunity to hear from several folks who have been impacted, different industries that are being hurt by these sweeping land grabs, I guess is the best way to call those. But the other thing that is, I think, critical for all of us to think through as citizens is where do we weigh in, and what is the conversation that we should be having about these critical issues. We live in a time when people are cynical about Washington and what's going on. And as I said before, this is not left and right issues. This is up, down, inside, outside issues. And so often it is the local voices that are silenced. And part of what needs to happen in terms of the Antiquities Act that we'll get to a little bit later in our program today is that when the decisions are made from here in Washington with the stroke of a pen, it doesn't allow the local leaders and the local citizens to be part of that process in a significant way. In particular, in Utah, we saw that where you had local officials from the county, the mayors, the commissioners, on up through the state legislature and the governor's office, were not in support of the monument, and yet all of that was sort of swept aside. And again, many of the loud outside voices that drowned out many of the locals in terms of how it was going to impact their lives and their communities. And so it's critical that we get to that. As we move forward, just to kind of give you a tee up here, So we will have some representation from Utah, from San Juan County. We'll also have some of our fishermen friends from up in the Northeast, as well as some other groups that'll be joining us as we go through the panel. We've also been joined. We have Matt Anderson here, who focuses on this for Sutherland, and we've also had some folks from PERC in terms of some of the nitty-gritty stuff. So those of you who are waiting for the policy portion of the program, that is coming as well. So we'll have that chance to drill down there just a little bit. Matt, is there anything else that we should be hitting here while we're just waiting a minute for Senator Lee to come through?
Just the importance of the media reform.
All right. So again, that is the key component there in terms of what comes next. And we really feel that today is not the end of this thing, and we are, as I mentioned earlier, we are really looking forward to the president moving forward on the recommendations that Secretary Zinke has put forward. We're hopeful they will do that sooner than later, because this is an opportunity to really move this forward, and it's a pivot point. While we're looking at the 4 particular areas that the Secretary has recommended, that's not the end of this. It's not just changing a few monuments that is the issue. The real issue is getting to the Antiquities Act, and as Congressman Bishop very rightly laid out, it's the Antiquities Act that really needs the major reform. I see we have the great senator from the state of Utah here, and so I will introduce Senator Lee, and as my former boss, this is my chance for revenge. Being able to introduce the senator. Actually, I've always dreamed of this opportunity to get even. It's not a very Utah thing, but we were in a meeting once, and as we were going around the table, everyone was introducing themselves, and I introduced myself as Senator Lee's Chief of Staff. And as soon as I finished introducing myself, the senator immediately chimed in and said, "Now, what Boyd isn't telling you is that he is a competitive clogger." And for the next 3 years, I had this group of people who I could never convince that the senator was joking, and I really have nothing to do with clogging. So I was going to introduce the senator as the chairman of the 37th chapter of the Prairie Dog and Sage Grouse Society, but I think maybe I'll hold off on that one. Senator Lee is a great champion of public lands. He's on the Energy and Natural Resource Committee, does incredible work there. He understands the constitutional component to this and the Antiquities Act, and has been a real champion in leading an important dialogue and discussion about our public lands, about the Antiquities Act. And so please welcome Senator Mike Lee.
As I recall, it wasn't just that I said you were a competitive clogger, but that you and your wife, Debbie, and all 5 of your children had participated internationally in clogging festivals. It was good times. As I entered the building a few minutes ago, I was told, Mike, your friend Boyd is vamping for you in there, and at first I thought he said vaping for you. I've never seen Boyd vape. I can't really imagine that. Made sense once I heard the whole word. It's a real pleasure to be with you, and it's a pleasure to be here with my friend Boyd Matheson. He is not only my former chief of staff, he is my longtime friend. Sometimes referred to him also as my mentor and spiritual guru and political advisor, all rolled into one. Boyd Matheson and his associates at the Sutherland Institute, based in Salt Lake City, is doing yeoman's work on public lands issues. And in addition to that, Boyd and the Sutherland Institute are doing all kinds of amazing things, developing a reform agenda to benefit Utah's working families and to make America's economy a more upwardly mobile thing. I also want to thank, as always, the Heritage Foundation for hosting this event. When it comes to land issues, Heritage is one of the few institutions in this city that consistently looks out for people in Western states, instead of just the special interests that seem always to be arrayed against those Western states. And of course, I want to acknowledge the Property and Environment Research Center, which is fighting many of the same battles in the state of Montana, where almost 1/3 of the land is controlled by the federal government. I'm glad to see that PERC is lending its expertise to this important discussion. We're here to talk about presidential abuses of the Antiquities Act. All told, presidents have used this law to cordon off tens of millions of acres of land from recreation, from all kinds of economic activity, and they have done this with shockingly little regard for those few Americans who live and work in the areas affected by these land designations under the Antiquities Act. For years, gatherings like this one were weighed down by an awful sense of resignation, by a sense that however hard we struggled, we were always in a defensive crouch, always bracing for the next executive order, always anticipating that next proclamation to be issued by a president under the Antiquities Act, the next million-acre-plus monument to designate as a result of presidential action. Happily, there is no need for that kind of resigned pessimism today. As a result of last year's election, we finally have the political power to do something about the Antiquities Act and to get to the root of the problem so that we don't have to live with this kind of fear constantly. Our unified Republican government has a rare and I believe invaluable opportunity to prove to millions of Americans in the West that their concerns matter too, that they don't always have to be a marginalized voice in our system of government, that they are represented in this town too, and not just the environmental groups and their activists and their donors who live here and vacation there. If we can prove this by curbing abuses of the Antiquities Act, we will begin to bridge the urban-rural divide that is so apparent in our politics and that seems to be emerging as a more consistent theme. So apparent that it looms sort of like a chasm in our discourse. Public land issues inflame relations between the American people and the federal government, as they have going back to at least the 19th century. In my home state of Utah, the public's distrust of Washington is rooted not in ideology, but in experience. The experience of living in a state where a whopping 2/3 of the land is owned by the federal government and managed by unaccountable agencies that are either indifferent or, in many cases, downright hostile to the interests of local communities, the very same local communities they are supposed to serve, the very same local communities that are most affected by their arbitrary decisions 2,000 miles away. The Antiquities Act is, of course, an important part of this experience. For a short, sort of innocuous-sounding law, it contains a whole lot of what I came to Washington to fight against. And that's because at its core, the Antiquities Act takes power away from the people and their representatives while giving it to the president and to unelected bureaucrats and to wealthy, well-connected special interests in Washington. It might help to give just a little bit of background about this act, about where it came from, and about how it's been used and abused over the years. The Antiquities Act was, of course, signed into law by President Theodore Roosevelt back in 1906. As its name suggests, it was created for a very specific purpose, to protect mainly objects of historic and cultural interest. The word antiquities, after all, appears to have reference to man-made artifacts, pottery, coins, statues of nude discus throwers, and that guy holding the spear in a contrapposto form. I believe his name was Doryphorus from my college humanities classes. Things like that. In particular, our Antiquities Act was intended to protect American Indian archaeological sites from treasure hunters, those who would go in and loot the land and then sell them illegally, who were disturbing the sites in search of prizes, in search of their own profit. In order to defend America's cultural heritage, the law authorized the President of the United States to declare sites on public lands as national monuments, subject to greater restrictions on their use. In other words, once the president designated a national monument, it would elevate the site in question to a higher level of scrutiny, giving more discretion to federal land managers with jurisdiction over that land. But this authorization did not give the president carte blanche authority. The monuments were supposed to be modest in size. By law, they were supposed to be narrowly tailored to serve the purpose of preservation that the president had in mind. In fact, the law provides that monuments shall be, quote, confined to the smallest area compatible with the proper care and maintenance of the objects to be protected, close quote. Early versions of the bill even limited monuments to around 640 acres in size. But as you know, modest laws, passed even with the best of intentions, can be twisted over time to serve big government, to feed the beast that dwells in this city. Utahns have learned this lesson repeatedly through sad experience. Last December, in the 11th hour of his presidency, President Obama used the Antiquities Act to rope off millions of acres of federal land as new national monuments. As part of this midnight monument designation spree, President Obama designated 1.3 million acres in southern Utah as the Bears Ears National Monument. This occurring on December 28, 2016, in the final days of his presidency. Utahns who opposed the monument by supermajority margins at the time of its creation were indignant. And none were more indignant than the residents of San Juan County, where the monument is located. Found in the southeast corner of our state, San Juan County is home to unbelievable beauty, and it's home to some amazing people. It also happens to be Utah's poorest county, and it's a place where the federal government owns well in excess of 90% of the land. This limits the opportunities for residents of San Juan County to do things they would otherwise do. They have to get permission for just about any activity imaginable to operate on federal public land. As a result of this and other factors, including the fact that that land isn't something that they can tax, they have a limited property tax base, and this provides them with a limited pool of revenue from which to draw to operate their schools, their search and rescue operations, their fire services, and so forth. San Juan locals were rightly fearful about what a monument would mean for their future. If Bears Ears turned out like other monuments in the country, it might mean the loss of economic opportunity in an already struggling county. It would mean closed roads and closed ranches. Yes, Utahns were indignant about President Obama's midnight monument, but we weren't entirely surprised. We had been through this ordeal 20 years before under President Bill Clinton. In September 1996, President Clinton roped off 1.7 million acres in southern Utah as an election year sop to environmentalists, to the environmentalist wing of the Democratic Party. This vast tract of land is known today as the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. Like President Obama, President Clinton didn't bother consulting with Utah's leaders and local officials before making this proclamation. In fact, he didn't even notify Utah's congressional delegation until the day before the announcement. And the best part? When the announcement was made, it took place in Arizona, 100 miles from the Utah state border. They chose to avoid Utah so that protests by locals who would be affected by this very designation didn't spoil the president's carefully orchestrated campaign photo op. Now, the saying goes that one's an incident and two's a coincidence, but I've been around long enough to know a trend when I see one. 2 times in as many decades, a majestically aloof executive has annexed a vast tract of land in Utah, larger than the state of Delaware. Sometimes we like to refer to things as bigger than Rhode Island. This one isn't just bigger than Rhode Island, it's also bigger than Delaware. 2 times this decision has been made without taking into account the concerns of local residents. Indeed, the decisions proceeded over the express opposition of local residents. And that opposition simmers to this very day. Polling shows that 61% of residents in southern Utah want the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument reduced in size, and 68% want the Bears Ears National Monument reduced. In other words, the Utahns who live closest to the monuments are among those most likely to favor the reduction of the monuments. They're the ones who see the enervating effect of federal regulations on their own communities, on their own ways of life every single day. They're the ones who have to bear the burden of this on a day-to-day basis. They are not the ones who are allowed to simply dream of these vast tracts of federal land in some far-off place in the square states, as many Easterners like to refer to the states of the Rocky Mountains, where space is plentiful and where they like to dream of federal management of land as if it somehow makes it more majestic the more the federal government micromanages that land. That fact touches on one of the real realities of Antiquities Act abuse, but more generally of our federal land regulations as a whole and of the whole of our federal land ownership policies. Failing to consult with people who live and work around a potential monument isn't just a breach of political etiquette. It isn't just the political equivalent of walking in someone's putt on the green. It isn't just a tone-deaf photo op. No, it's an attack on our very Republican form of government, a form of government that is weakened whenever this happens. And this is a type of act that weakens rural communities by robbing them of agency, of self-determination, and of opportunity on the surrounding lands. Utah's economy is built on the farm and agriculture industry, particularly in southern Utah. Livestock is the state's single largest sector of farm income. But of the 45 million acres of rangeland in Utah, nearly 3/4 is owned and managed by the federal government. Since the 1940s, federal agencies have slashed livestock grazing on rangelands in Utah by more than 50%, a policy of economic deprivation that accelerated after 1996 on land within the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. So if you're a rancher in Utah, you almost certainly rely on federal public land for your grazing opportunities. Those grazing opportunities have been steadily diminished over the last few decades. I think most Americans would agree with me that federal land regulations in Utah are quite arguably a case study in government-sponsored neglect, if not outright tyranny. They bring to mind a line from the Declaration of Independence, where the colonists charged that King George had, quote, erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. But for too many politicians, and for the radical environmental groups that fund their perpetual reelection, Bears Ears and Grand Staircase are textbook models for what they deem to be the proper application of the Antiquities Act. That is precisely why Congress and this administration must fight back. I'm heartened by the steps that have been taken by the Trump administration thus far. In April, the President ordered Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke to undertake a review of major monuments created under the Antiquities Act over the last few decades. After a 4-day listening tour across southern Utah, Secretary Zinke submitted an interim report recommending major reduction of the Bears Ears National Monument. A final recommendation is being prepared even as we speak, and I look forward to seeing that final recommendation. Such a reduction would provide needed relief to Utahns. It would bring Bears Ears into line with the Antiquities Act by limiting it to the smallest area compatible with the preservation of its treasures, and such a reduction would be well supported by history. Presidents of the United States have reduced the size of monuments by hundreds of thousands of acres, by as much as 89% of the original reservation, the original designation in question. But a reduction by presidential order is not, in my opinion, enough. It's an important first step, but it's not the entire journey. because presidential orders are, of course, reversible. As President Obama is finding out, if your legacy lives by executive power, it can just as easily be undone by executive power as well. So if Bears Ears is reduced, there will be nothing to stop future presidents from dramatically expanding the boundaries of existing monuments or creating new monuments entirely. What's needed is wholesale reform of the Antiquities Act to return its monumental power back to where it belongs, to the people who reside closest to the proposed monuments. Local residents must have ultimate say over whether their communities can be upended in this way. At the very least, the Antiquities Act should be reformed so that the people's elected representatives in Congress, the political body that is closest to the people, most responsive to the people, and accountable to the people at the most regular intervals, can review monument designations. And so that Congress itself, designated as the sole legislative organ within the federal government, can legislate. What we've effectively done with the Antiquities Act, like so many other delegations of legislative power to the executive branch, is hand over the lawmaking power to people who occupy the Article II branch, those who are not subject at such regular intervals as are members of Congress to elections. Reforming the Antiquities Act to limit the president's authority is a no-brainer. It's a policy that is consistently supported by a majority of Utahns. It's a policy that is supported by the Constitution itself, and I'm confident that it's supported by a majority of residents of the Intermountain West, where so much federal public land can be found. This, incidentally, is one of the reasons why it can be so difficult to get people's attention on this issue in this town. East of Colorado, you find basically no state where the federal government owns more than 15% of the land. Colorado and west, you won't find any state where the federal government owns less than 15% of the land. In many states like Montana, that federal land ownership can be 1/3. In many states like Utah, that federal land ownership can be much larger. And in the case of my state, 2/3, approaching 70% of our land is owned by the federal government. So I hope my colleagues in Congress will heed the outcry coming from the West. For too long, residents of Western states like mine have felt ignored, crossed over by politicians who felt more interested in helping coastal interest groups than them. And as we've seen too often, this failure of representation leads to anger. It at a minimum, leads to bewilderment. I'm reminded of a letter I received from a young man in Utah last year. His name is Lane Palmer. I'd like to read portions of his letter to you. This young man wrote, quote, "I live within 5 miles of the proposed Bears Ears National Monument. Is there even any legislation written for the monument yet? If not, why? How can there be an argument for one side or the other if there's not even any legislation to show and explain what is going to happen exactly?" It's a good point. Lane goes on, "It is in my best interest to protect the land, but it's also in my best interest to use the land and be productive, because that is our livelihood here in San Juan County. I was wondering if I could receive a copy of the legislation so I can read it for myself and not go off of what others say." This letter crushes me. Here's a young man who's concerned about his community. And like so many other people in Utah, he is as concerned about the environment as any environmental activist on the East Coast might be. He is concerned most immediately about this land because it affects him. He doesn't want to see it corrupted or polluted or misused or abused. This is a young man who's trying to get informed about an issue that will somewhat uniquely affect him, his neighbors, his friends, and his family. And the honest answer I have to give him as his elected representative is that Bears Ears was not the product of legislation at all. There wasn't any formal debate in Congress about this particular monument. Instead, there was a much abused law from 1906 and a president armed with a pen and a phone. It's up to us to change that. It's time to change that. Thank you very much.
All right. right, and with that, I'll go ahead and reintroduce Ryan Benally. Again, Ryan lives in San Juan County. He sits on the Utah Navajo Trust Fund Advisory Committee. He's a member of the Red Mesa chapter of the Navajo Nation. And most important, he is an Iraqi war veteran. We thank you for your service. Let me also go ahead and introduce two other speakers who will follow Ryan. Bob Myers. Bob has worked at the Maine Snowmobile Association since 1995, taking over as executive director in 1997. He runs the day-to-day operations there. He is a self-proclaimed semi-serious snowmobiler. But the Snowmobile Association represents 26,000 snowmobilers and about 2,100 businesses that belong to about 289 clubs up there in his neck of the woods. Then we will hear from Grant Moore. Grant is the president of the Atlantic Offshore Lobstermen's Association, and he will not only represent them, but really is here on behalf of all of those that are in the fishing industry. And he began back in the 1970s, so he has seen this battle and what happens up close and personal. And so we really appreciate his perspective today. And again, this really shows us that this is not just a Western lands issue, but it spreads all the way across the country, and really no one is out of reach of the Antiquities Act as it's currently constituted, and why we need that change. So with that, we'll turn it over to Ryan. Thank you.
Thank you, Boyd. Yalt Eshike Dosha Dene, Ryan Benally Inishke. Adonea, Nishlinigi, Quadlini Nishlinki Ani Bashichi Tkachini Dashit Ashti Dashanala. Akot Egal Danenishla, Montezuma Creek, Utah Dena Shah. Rebecca Benally Eshama, Ray Benally Jr. A. Shije. Good morning. My name is Ryan Benally. I'm from Montezuma Creek, Utah. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the Heritage Foundation for hosting me to be here, as well as Sutherland's Institute for inviting me to this event. They have been crucial for giving local landowners, recreationists, farmers, ranchers, and Native Americans like myself a proper voice in our struggle against federal overreach. I'd like everyone here to go ahead and imagine that you're back in grade school. The bell just rang for recess, and your 10 classmates and you are getting ready to go to the playground. It's a wonderful playground with many areas to spend, your recess time. From swings to slides to jungle gyms, there's even a merry-go-round. Multiple equipped playground environment your friends have acquainted themselves with to their liking. Nothing is off limits because everything is of multiple use. All of a sudden, two children begin to tell the other kids, you can't play in those swings because, well, we just don't like that you're able to swing efficiently. You're disturbing the ground because beneath the swing seats, everyone then asks, why shouldn't we enjoy the swings? I mean, children have been playing on those swings for generations, and they've managed to maintain the area better than ever. None of the children did anything wrong or harm the equipment. They too have managed to convince younger generations of children to keep the swings in pristine condition, like generations before them. In fact, the entire playground is in pristine condition because prior to those two children wanting to shut off access, everyone understood what it looked like to keep the playground in good working order for everyone to enjoy. Now, without warning, everyone's ability to enjoy the jungle gym is cut off. Seems the same two children had a bit of extra money than the other kids and ran an opinion poll with loaded questions. The poll is just enough to convince the heavy-handed authority of their teachers to shut off access to the jungle gym under the pretense that restricting access is best for everyone because it saves the playground. The two children felt that since the playground is in immaculate condition, no one should then harm the area because it should only be used their way. let's not forget it took everyone's hard work, dedication, devotion to this playground to keep it in the best possible shape while maintaining a sense of multiple use. This tiny example reflects what local residents like myself and many others have been struggling with in the form of Bears Ears National Monument. For generations, I've seen, read, and researched how hardworking people have kept lands near and around Bears Ears in excellent condition. I mean, I've only need to look at a data sheet comparisons from year 1915 to the year 1998 to see how soil conservation through mechanically treated and seeded areas have improved soil surface and vegetation. Radical environmentalist organizations would do so well as to relax from their rhetoric of land destruction and their attempts to create a false sense of urgency. It would be wise of them to see how local folks have done a better job for the lands through the generations than they ever could preserving and protecting our pristine Bears Ears areas. In fact, there's 10 huge wilderness areas within the monument, along with a super restrictive special recreation management area in the Cedar Mesa area, all comprising tighter and stronger federal protections within Bears Ears Monument, stronger than Bears Ears Monument would ever have. Of course, you know, we can't forget the already existing 11 separate federal laws in place for decades meant to protect Native American cultural heritage and sacred sites already in existence prior to the designation. From the standpoint of being a member of the Navajo Nation, I'm thoroughly disappointed with how the Navajo Nation officials have made uninformed decisions. They've partnered with radical environmentalist groups under false pretenses and shown how out of touch with the people they are who've elected them. Falsehoods like how lands in and around Bears Ears cultural sites would fall prey to destructive, extractive industries. A person simply has to look at a map of the entire Bears Ears National Monument to see that ancient Native American cultural heritage sites and sacred areas are, already protected. Monument proponents say that they have been working on this monument for 80 years. But that's far from the truth. According to former Navajo Nation Council delegate and Council Speaker Lawrence T. Morgan, who spent 20 years with the Navajo Nation Council, he stated, and I quote, "Never was a time anyone, anywhere, mentioned or talked about the existence of Bears Ears. Not even previous council delegates from Utah area of Navajo Nation. Until recently, through media, we've all learned of Bears Ears," end quote. Should Bears Ears National Monument stand? Well, according to Southwest Indian Foundation, which provides heating assistance to Navajo families, 54% of Navajo families burn wood for heating. We as Native American people use the land to wood gather in the ways that work for us. And with this monument, we'd only see more restrictions. I mean, sure, wood gathering might exist with a monument designation within a proclamation, but how would elderly Navajo grandmas and elderly Navajo grandpas ever march into those wooded areas without the assistance of their vehicles and cut wood without the assistance of a chainsaw? Because of those restrictions of a monument designations, mechanized tools, motorized vehicles are off limits. I mean, living in the 21st century, how could you carry out wood by horseback or use hand cutting tools with 100-year-old technology? That's not good enough for the 1,000 Navajos without power. And that's according to the Navajo Times. Particularly our elderly people who've gone all their lives without the simple ability to even turn on a light switch in their home. A restrictive and unnecessary national monument isn't good enough. for heating our Utah Navajo homes, and certainly isn't good enough to sustain a standard of living when Navajo families simply struggle to put food on the table. A national monument was never an answer to protect the sacred, to protect from energy extraction, as there was never a threat. Nor was it ever meant to be the epitome of Native American sovereignty. It simply was a favor to radical environmentalist organizations with close ties to multi-million-dollar tourism companies. What in the world was one more monument going to do that 5 other nearby national monuments couldn't achieve for radical environmentalist aggression? It seems to me that federal overreach couldn't answer that question either. Yet more monuments and more monuments, more. Whatever it is that they're lacking in another national monument really doesn't seem to be the solution. It was and is never what we wanted as a people, particularly Utah Navajos like myself. With examples like these, I would like to just say that the Antiquities Act probably would need to have a second glance at it. And I'm glad that we actually have the ability to raise our voices in a way that we never could. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone.
Morning. My name is Bob Myers, and I'm the Executive Director of the Maine Snowmobile Association, and I am a semi-serious snowmobiler. We represent snowmobile clubs across the state, and those clubs maintain 14,500 miles of trails in our state, 95% of which are on private land. Our interest in the Antiquities Act has been a bit of a twist, because in addition to the usual conservation and preservation players, we believe we can reasonably argue that the Katahdin Woods and Waters Monument in Maine was purchased from the federal bureaucracy. We're really lucky in Maine. We have a very rich tradition of public recreational access on private land. For generations, we have had virtually unfettered access to millions of acres of land in northern Maine for hunting, snowmobiling, camping, and other activities. Excellent state liability laws help support that, and most landowners view it as a civic responsibility, provided the users behave themselves and the activities don't interfere with their management objectives. In 2001, Roxanne Quimby sold her cosmetic company, Burt's Bees, for approximately $500 million, with much of the proceeds going to her foundation, Elliotsville Plantation. She soon began buying parcels of land in the Maine woods, and in 2002 made her first significant purchase, a 23,000-acre township adjacent to Maine's iconic Baxter State Park, which is 235,000 acres. Shortly thereafter, she announced her intentions to make additional purchases and create a national park. Ultimately, she purchased 87,000 acres in proximity to Baxter Park. During that same time, she prohibited hunting, snowmobiling, trapping, and virtually all traditional activities that were enjoyed by residents and visitors alike. She was met with a firestorm of resistance from local communities and groups like us and the Maine Forest Products Council. She didn't help her plan at all by being dismissive of the locals, who she described in one magazine interview as being stupid, lazy, and on drugs. There's nothing terribly unique about the land she was buying. For the most part, it was heavily cut over industrial timberland, noted only for its fine views of Mount Katahdin, Maine's highest peak, from some high ground. And it's kind of interesting, of all these professions of claiming to want to protect the forest, in the process of doing her acquisition, she created a whole new metric of liquidation harvesting in the state. Maine had some very significant laws passed to prevent liquidation harvesting, which would be a timber company would come in, they'd buy a parcel of land, they'd cut it heavily, and then divide it into kingdom lots and sell it off to people. She came in she would buy, landowner would buy the land, cut it about as hard as they could, and she'd buy it for what they paid for it. And so essentially she was encouraging the liquidation harvesting. So right now there's super views from the monument of Mount Katahdin and Baxter State Park, which, by the way, this would make the only national monument that was created because of its views into a state park. But when the trees grow back, there's not going to be anything to see. In 2010, some major events happened that moved her plan forward. She had long since worn out her welcome and stepped back from her project, turning the management over to her son, Lucas St. Clair, who was friendly, well-spoken, and a playback machine for the public relations firms that she had hired. At the same time, 2 paper mills in the area that were major employers shut down, and the local towns were soon looking at double-digit employment. Their talking points immediately pivoted from natural preservation to building the local tourism economy. Even with all this, not a single member of Maine's congressional delegation would sponsor legislation to create a national park. Roxanne was gone from public view, but had shifted her operations to Washington. After several 7-digit donations to the National Park Foundation and generous contributions to political campaigns, President Obama appointed Roxanne to the board of the National Park Foundation. With that board appointment came access to staffers, consultants, and other insiders, and soon after, talk of the monument designation began. Our epiphany was at a forum back in 2016 where National Park Director John Jarvis came to Maine for a community discussion about the monument. Well, the community discussion was held over an hour's drive away from the monument. It featured approximately 12 busloads of environmental activists that were bussed up from Portland. And his memorable quote of the evening was, "The Park Service loves wealthy people because they give us their money, and ask their wealthy friends to give us their money too." And how? In the meantime, the opposition was still strong and vocal, but was being countered by a host of statewide and national environmental groups, most of whom were now the beneficiaries of the largesse of the Elliottsville Plantation Foundation. Non-binding votes in 3 towns surrounding the monument recorded 2-to-1 opposition to the plan, which was countered by polling numbers skewed by southern Maine that showed 60% support. The Quimbys sweetened the pot with a pledge of up to $40 million endowment to build the infrastructure of the monument. And finally, in August of last year, President Obama signed the Monument Declaration. Since then, little has changed. The monument is sorely lacking in infrastructure and limited staff. It has no budget, and Quimby never did buy any roads into it, relying instead on deeded easements on timber management roads. This is an incredibly dangerous situation, as the only motorized access to the monument lands is over 1.5 lane wide dirt roads where Mr. and Mrs. Tourist and Johnny will, in the back seat in the Prius, are driving around looking for moose and squirrels and are suddenly faced with about 275,000 pounds of logs coming towards them at 60 miles an hour. The monument management plan is a work in progress. While we'd be happy to see the president rescind the designation, our concern is that this would do little more than keep the lawyers busy for the next 20 years. We have opted instead to advocate for the Park Service to turn the management over to the state's Bureau of Public Lands, which has far more expertise with the local landscape. There's already a model for this with our Allagash Wilderness Waterway, which is a federal wild and scenic river, but has been managed successfully by the state since the early 1970s. Thank you.
Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank the Heritage Foundation and the Sutherland Institute for inviting me down here. It's going to be quite evident to all of you that this is not my job. I am not a speaker. I am a fisherman. I've been a fisherman for, I'm embarrassed to say this, 45 years. It's a very interesting process, this whole monument. About 18 years ago, I was offshore on a lazy day hauling gear, and the conversation was, hey, did you hear that they're talking about designating areas out in the middle of the ocean as monuments? And so the scuttlebutt was, no way, they'll never do this. That can't happen. Why would they want to do that? Who's going to come 150 miles offshore to see a monument? What's going to be the basis for this? Well, in August of 2015, we learned of a kind of a closed-door campaign started by powerful NGO environmental groups to create a monument, Cassius Ledge, 3 canyons, and then from the Hague Line down to these 3 canyons, basically the whole eastern side of Georges Bank. September 15th, NOAA decided that they'd hold a town hall meeting in Providence, Rhode Island, which, interestingly enough, the public comment period was closed that day before we even were presented with anything. So industry went to that meeting. We were basically put to the back of the line. We were held to our 2 minutes of comments, and we saw this presentation that was basically about preserving deep-sea corals. That was the pretense that they came after the North Atlantic Canyon and Seamount Monument, was deep-sea corals. Deep-sea corals exist, 90% of those corals exist in waters deeper than 375 fathoms. Our fishing practices take place 275 fathoms in shoaler. I heard the word pristine today. That's an interesting word because that was fired at us too. The pristine coral beds, the pristine environment. That environment is pristine, but yet we've had fishing activity there for over 45 years. So the footprint that we're leaving, I want to know what kind of damage we're doing. Anyway, so we had those comments, we had those conversations. The next year, industry wrote many letters. We attended countless meetings. We gathered our own economic impact data to present to Senate and congressional staffers who worked incredibly hard representing the industry. Through basically our realization of what was happening, we did get the attention of the Council of Environmental Quality, and there were only 3 of us that were given privy to sit with those people and make our own presentations. We actually proposed a monument area. We sat down with them. We felt at the time that what we were seeing was basically a legacy grab and a win-win for the environmental groups. We proposed an area that was 5.5 times larger than what the existing monument is now. It would not have affected any of the fishing activities that take place. It would have protected the deep sea corals and given them a larger area. We were told, interestingly enough, that the area was too big, which all of us were like, this is incredible. Bear with me, please. I think when it all comes down to the fishing industry, and I'm speaking for the industry, I'm not speaking for my association or the Mass Lobstermen's Association or the New England Garden State Association, or I'm fishing for the New England fishing industry, which is a historical industry that with I mean, years and years and years of history. My son is now running our boat. I'm here now, and the reason I'm here is because I care about it. I care that we leave the next generation, that we leave them a sustainable fishery. I'm sorry, it gets pretty emotional. We're not opposed to monuments. We're opposed to the process in which it was done. It was not transparent. It was not open. If we hadn't stumbled upon what was happening, we would have had a signature, and we wouldn't have had a say at all. What they've done now is they've closed off an area that has affected the pelagic longline fleet, the squid, whiting, butterfish, lobster, Jonah crab, red crab fleet, which annually, the total value annually is about $35 to $40 million. which reflected on the multiplier, which is given by NOAA, is over $100 million annually. Might not sound like a lot of money to a lot of people, but for the New England fishing industry, it is. And it's a small group of people that fish these 3 canyons and the pelagic fleet that fishes the seamounts. I echo Senator Lee's comments about the use and abuse of the Antiquities Act. The Antiquities Act, United States Marine EEZ zone, is not land owned or controlled by the United States, and therefore falls outside of the Antiquity Act authority. So it's clearly stated in the Antiquity Acts that it's lands owned by the federal government. The oceans aren't owned by the federal government. I know now that I met with Representative Secretary Zinke. I met with Chairman Bishop. He actually came up to New Bedford and sat at a table with us. We took him out on a ferry ride all through the harbor, a cold, rainy day. I just had my knee replaced. I was holding on for dear life, but I wanted to be there because he had the true interest to be there and hear our story. Secretary Zinke, we met in Boston. He, again, listened to us. His proposal now is to allow the fishing to continue, and that's a terrific, plus for the industry, but it's a Band-Aid, okay? And we need to reform the Antiquities Act so it's not abused. Nobody should have the power with the stroke of a pen to put people out of business. Nobody, all right? It has to go through a public process. Our industry is governed by Magnuson-Stevens. We sit down, it's an open, public, totally analyzed before any rulemaking. I'm bound and governed under the New England Fisheries Management Council. They're bound under Magnuson-Stevens, and that's the way it works, not by the stroke of a pen. So, again, I want to thank everybody, and I wish I was more prepared. I wish I'd brought a slide that I could put up there to show you our monument area, but listening to the other stories here today, I feel great. You know why? Because we're not alone. It's everywhere. I never realized, the scope of what's been going on. And the sooner that it's addressed, these things won't happen, and they shouldn't happen to any of us. Thanks very much.
Wonderful. Thanks again to Ryan, to Bob, and to Grant for sharing your stories and that real life impact. And I'm going to say it one more time. We have to remember this is about people, and this is about communities first, last, and always. We're going to shift gears now, and I'm actually going to turn the podium over to Katie Tubb, who is a policy analyst in the Institute for Economic Freedom here at Heritage, and she will introduce our next panel as we get a little bit of drill down into the Antiquities Act. Katie?
Thank you all for being here today. If I could have the last group of panelists come on up. What we're going to do is about 5 minutes from each of our panelists. We're all analysts dealing with these issues. A little bit of moderated discussion, and then any questions from you also as we're talking. Go ahead and think about any questions you would have for our analysts from the rest of this morning. So as our analysts are coming up, I'd like to introduce first Matt Anderson to my left. He's the director of the Southern Institute's Coalition for Self-Government in the West. He's an active member of his community, serves as a state delegate and a precinct chair. He's involved in a number of conservation organizations, and he graduated from Utah State University with a degree in political science and is pursuing a master's in political science with an emphasis in natural resources and public lands policy. I should also add that he's an avid fly fisherman and enjoys ATV riding and camping in Utah. And I would add that just because it's easy to think that here we are, the talking heads, we don't know anything and don't enjoy public lands and we would just like to pave them all over. But I think it's important to emphasize that all these people up here do care about the environment and enjoying it. So Matt Anderson. next to me here is Hannah Downey. She is a research fellow and the policy and partnerships coordinator at the Property and Environment Research Center. She graduated from Montana State University with degrees in economics and political science. She has worked as a wilderness backpack guide and enjoys skiing, mountain biking, and rock climbing. And finally, we have R.J. Smith, who is the distinguished fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute Center for Energy and Environment. And he is a senior research fellow in environmental policy at the National Center for Public Policy and Research. He also serves as director of the Center for Private Conservation. RJ comes with a huge variety of experience, including serving as a president of a local chapter for the Audubon Society. He was a consultant at Department of Interior and at the President's Council on Environmental Quality, and he has served as special assistant for the EPA. With that, Hannah, if you would please start first, and we'll just go right down the line.
Awesome. Hi, I'm Hannah Downey. I'm with the Property and Environment Research Center, also known as PERC, in Bozeman, Montana. PERC is a nonprofit research institute dedicated to improving environmental quality through the application of property rights and markets. We have a long history of addressing public lands issues, and so today I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between national parks and national monuments, which I think is a really big distinction that has to be made as we're having these conversations about what are national monuments, what are we going to do with them. So some basic generalities, and again, there are exceptions to about everything I'm going to say, so these are pretty general. To start off with, national parks are created by Congress. It's a lengthier or longer process, and they're created essentially to preserve landscapes and provide recreation. They're managed by the National Park Service, pretty uniform all there. And those lands, national parks actually can be added to, so we can expand the federal estate with national parks. A big funding source for that is the Land and Water Conservation Fund. New lands can be purchased. National monuments, on the other hand, are a little bit more complicated. One, they're created unilaterally by the president, as many people today have already mentioned. That power is granted to him through the Antiquities Act. And the purpose of those lands is, or at least in theory, is to preserve those antiquities, cultural sites, historical sites, landmarks, those sorts of things. And again, in theory, to the smallest size and scope possible. As many people have vouched for today, what that actually looks like in effect is kind of different than the original intent. As for the management of those lands, things get even more complicated. National monuments, some are managed by the National Park Service. There's some overlap there with national parks. But a lot are managed by the U.S. Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, NOAA, even the Department of Defense, Department of Energy. Some of these monuments are even managed in collaboration between those agencies. So here we see even some more difficulty in ensuring that there's comprehensive management, kind of understanding what's going on there. There's different levels of authority and kind of different backgrounds going into this with those different agencies. So the big question that a lot of people have already touched on today is kind of what are the allowed uses in those various areas. National parks, uses are pretty restricted. There's no hunting, no mining. Other kind of resource consumptive activities aren't authorized. It's truly to preserve those landscapes and provide some recreation. Of course, there are some pretty popular instances where that's not true that people point out. For example, Capitol Reef National Park, some grazing was grandfathered in. So there are, of course, always some exceptions. With national monuments, there's this weird middle ground of kind of what's allowed. It really kind of depends on what's in the proclamation for that specific monument and what's in the management plan for that specific monument. In general, existing uses such as grazing, mineral leases, oil and gas, timber, those sorts of things can be grandfathered in to the creation of the national monument. However, as other people have also vouched for, the actual management plans for those things and what happens in actuality, there can be restrictions. Even when things are grandfathered in name, what actually happens, we often see reductions in the actual level of use. And again, there are some instances such as when President Clinton designated the Sonoran Desert National Monument, he straight up said in the proclamation, no grazing. So again, really dependent on the national monument, but in general, existing uses were previously allowed. And again, we can contrast that kind of with the multiple use lands that these monuments and parks are usually created out of, where there are kind of those traditional uses allowed, and new leases, grazing permits, etc., can be issued. So as we're going through all of these monument debates and seeing what's going on, there's a lot of confusion as to what is a national monument. Is it a national park? Is it, it's managed by the Forest Service? Is it Forest Service land? There's all this confusion, and I think it's really important that we take the time to actually think about what are the differences in these types of lands and the actual differences in these proclamations, and how does that impact our use of these lands.
Thanks, Hannah. And I want to send a thank you out to the Heritage Foundation for hosting this event and really giving a voice to locals like Grant, Bob, and Ryan, who know and love our public lands and waterways the most. It's locals who should be heard because they're the ones who know our public lands. They live with them every day, and they're impacted most by the decisions that are made on them. So as has been mentioned before by Congressman Bishop, there's been 16 presidents who have used the Antiquities Act to either designate or expand national monuments across the country. And although there have been fluctuations over the past 111 years of these designations and expansions, the last 40 has really seen a significant hike in the amount of land and water being designated by presidents of both parties. The pie chart that will be put up here in just a minute, it's going to show how presidents are breaking from historical norms and designating much more land than they ever have before. As you can see by the chart, the last 4 administrations, so that's the Carter, Clinton, George W. Bush, and Obama administrations, have designated 99% of the land and water that have been put under national monument status. So clearly it's not the same as it once was. We're seeing breaks from what's going on, and really a troubling trend. But it's not just the amount, it's also your average designation is growing too, as evidenced by the next slide. So when you look at the next slide, President Theodore Roosevelt, the first president to use the Antiquities Act, designated 18 national monuments for a total of around 1.5 million acres. The average size of his designation was 85,000 acres. Now, contrast that with President Barack Obama, who designated and expanded national monuments 34 times, for a total of almost 554 million acres. Each action by Obama placed an average of over 16 million acres under national monument status. So that's 16 million acres on average per designation. This is more than 191 times larger than the average of those designated under the Roosevelt administration. So just 111 years, we're seeing 191 times more land and water being designated. But it's interesting, this trend is not exclusive to the Obama and the Roosevelt comparison. When you compare the first 8 administrations to use the Antiquities Act with the last 8, we see that average acquisitions are 89 times larger with the last 8. This is a problem, and it's growing, and it's not going anywhere as we currently sit. Now, while there's a number of consequences that stem from large national monuments, 3 in particular stand out. First, expansive national monuments violate the original intent of the Antiquities Act. We've heard that. Again, these monuments were supposed to be small. When Congress debated this, numbers of 320 acres or 640 acres were thrown out, but Congress decided, well, I don't think a president will really abuse the authority that they're given, but we've seen quite the opposite. And they were also supposed to be, as mentioned, confined to cultural and historic sites, and they're not. The problem we're seeing today is that while there are historic and cultural objects within these monuments, they're being combined with millions and hundreds of thousands of additional acres for a variety of reasons. And we've heard environmental groups say, and I quote, that national monuments are our first line of defense against climate change. Now, we should be protecting the things that need protection, but if we're using other motivations, is protection and preservation really at the heart of what we're doing? I would submit that it's not. Second, expansive national monuments put antiquities at increased risk of destruction. So when you designate a national monument, you're signaling to the world and tourists to come and visit the place. You put up billboards, you run flyers and ads, and local communities do the best they can with the situation they have to try to bring in tourists and bolster local economies. But when you do that, you're also inviting more desecration and destruction of the objects you're trying to protect. When you invite the world, there's more demand on infrastructure needs and preservation and law enforcement that wasn't there before. Now, that's a serious problem, especially as we sit now with our federal land management agencies that are strapped for cash. The BLM, U.S. Forest Service, and National Park Service, which manage the majority of our national monuments, have a deferred maintenance backlog of $17 billion. They can't afford the additional protections that are needed for the increased tourism. Small monuments don't have the same problems that these large ones do because it's easier to manage and there's not the infrastructure needs purely because of size. Third, expansive monuments have unnecessarily high economic opportunity costs. National monuments can provide some benefit to local economies through tourism. No one disputes that. However, diverse economies are strong economies. When you solely rely an economy on one sector like tourism, you're opening up for a whole bunch of problems. I mean, take 2008, for example, when we saw the economic downturn. Tourism dropped significantly, and visitation and traveling also declined. When you have a host of economic activities, including tourism, logging, ranching, fishing, and mineral extraction and alternative forms of recreation, you're allowing the economy to survive and thrive because when one sector suffers, the entire local economy doesn't. And so it's just so important that tourism can be part of local economies, and it should be, but it can't be the sole economic driver to provide strong, healthy, and vibrant communities. And so with that, again, national monuments are growing, and until we reform the Antiquities Act, this is going to continue. It's not going anywhere. It's time to reform the Antiquities Act to really check expansive national monuments and bring the Antiquities Act in line with its original intent to protect our national treasures. Thanks. Turn it over to you.
Thank you. Well, I think once again I find myself on the rather extreme end of things. I would say that my remarks are basically the antiquated Antiquities Act should be repealed, not reformed, because I don't think it can possibly be reformed. While it provided a necessary function in 1906, it has long since served its purpose and for decades has done harm rather than doing good. In 1906, the West was nearly uninhabited. Very few people, especially on the public lands, and there were very few government agents, even on the government lands, and it was nearly impossible to police these areas. Indian archaeological sites, graveyards, ceremonial sites, cliff dwellings were being systematically looted and pillaged, and often by organized gangs that went from spot to spot. Fossil beds, petrified wood, unique geological features, and so on were also being destroyed or being collected and looted. So what Congress did, it passed this act to give the president the authority over these land sites, these treasures, to have special protection by authorizing the president to designate the smallest area necessary surrounding them to protect them as a national monument. Teddy Roosevelt's first national monument created the template for this. Devil's Tower in Wyoming. You probably all remember Devil's Tower from Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It's a rather unique igneous rock formation that stands about 1,000 feet up above the land. And it's about 1 mile in circumference around the area. And this monument was created with a mere 1,347 acres, just over 2 square miles, and the tower itself was 1 square mile. This was the smallest area compatible with the full protection of the site. And others were done in the same mold by Teddy Roosevelt. Montezuma's Castle in Arizona, one of the most pristine cliff dwellings in the country, was fully protected with a mere 162 acres. One much larger area, the Petrified Forest in Arizona, was 60,000 acres, but later it was reduced by 25,000 acres by President Taft. And then later on in history, President Hoover increased it again. So it shows that there's been flexibility. Some of these have been increased, and unfortunately, most of them have been increased in size. Today, the West is settled. There are people everywhere. There are armed federal agents, even in the most isolated areas of the West. There are cameras, infrared videos, motion sensors, planes, surveillance balloons, and even drones now. And it's often illegal to even pick up things on these federal lands. Arrowheads, beads, pestles and mortars, pottery shards, fossils, even if they're not in the original site where they are, if they've been carried by streams and flash floods for miles and miles away from where they originated, it can still be illegal to pick those up. So there's little, if any, need for such special designations today. I don't think that we can really make a justification for that. But instead, nevertheless, there's been a proliferation of these designations and of staggering size. They've gotten larger and larger over time and protecting nothing. With the mere stroke of a pen, the presidents have used their unilateral power to lock up hundreds of thousands of acres, and a couple times over 1 million, essentially exercising cost-free national land use control, preventing the American people, and especially the local people, from the use of the natural resources of these lands. It's basically an energy policy, a land use policy, rather than any kind of a conservation policy. The president unilaterally usurps congressional authority to create national parks and wilderness areas and disenfranchises the American people by turning multiple use lands into quasi-national parks and wilderness areas. So here we've gone from the first national monument being 1,347 acres to protect Devil's Tower, to the 1.9 million acres to create the Grand Staircase Escalante in New Mexico, which protected little of anything, or the 1.4 million acres for Bears Ears. And with no authority whatsoever coming from the Act, as our friend from the Lobsterman pointed out, they began creating marine national monuments in international, essentially in international waters. George W. Bush created the vast Pacific Remote Islands Marine National Monument, and with Obama's expansion, created a 500,000 square mile area as a national monument closed to fishing and all economic uses. Now compare the 2 square miles with Devil's Tower to 500,000 square miles that we're getting now. This is just growing and growing and growing in a terrible way. And this is little more than one-man rule and dictatorial rule decisions on how the lands and waters of America are going to be used. And the 1996 Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument was basically a lockup of the vast mineral and energy resources to serve as a bribe to the radical Greens who had threatened that they weren't getting enough from the Clinton administration, and if they didn't get more, what they were going to do, they were all going to abandon the Democratic Party and vote Green. So Clinton, Babbitt, and Podesta came up with this idea, and one of their main goals was to lock up what's called the Koparowitz coal deposits, one of the 2 largest EPA-compliant clean coal deposits on the planet, to prevent people from using that. And even worse today now, we have with the, I would say worse than the way they have been using national monument designations, which is simply locking up land that was already owned by the federal government. But now with the Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument, what they're doing is actually expanding the federal estate by finding ways to acquire private land, the land that the Quimby family gave to the government with the understanding that this would be turned into a national monument. And this is perhaps one of the most threatening developments that's come from all the national monument designations, because this is a long-term goal and dream of the environmentalists to essentially nationalize the 3.5 million acres of the North Main woods that have been run for a couple centuries as a private working forest that's provided jobs, well-paying jobs in rural Maine, provided for the maintenance of the local communities and counties, providing a tax base for them, and also providing recreation, hunting and fishing, snowmobiling, canoeing, camping, all of this for the public at a modest charge. And in fact, in the Reagan administration, in his 1964 annual report of the Council of Environmental Quality, they held up the concept of the North Main woods as a shining example of private conservation and how we should be managing these lands instead of having more and more government ownership of that. So I see no way that we can limit the ability of the president to do whatever he wants. And so I think we should move towards just repealing the act and going back to the normal ways of creating national parks and wilderness areas by the Congress making these decisions. Thank you.
Thank you all. I want to pick up on a few things that you all have mentioned, but also from the previous panel. But first, Hannah, I want to start with you in that you started to explain the difference between national monuments and national parks, and I think that's really important to understand because proponents of national monuments lately have done a very good job of blending those and convincing people that we're going to be selling Yosemite or paving over Yellowstone, and that's not the case. So if you could just expound on that a little bit for us.
Yeah, definitely. So as I'm sure everyone here has experienced to some extent, there's all of these calls that there's kind of this public opinion that national monuments are required to protect our public lands, and there's a lot of, I think, confusion there between national parks and national monuments. National parks, are set aside to preserve these landscapes and provide recreation. Much of the argument we're hearing with why we need to quote unquote protect Bears Ears, and then national monuments are this whole confusing entity in and of themselves. And this all makes sense. National monuments, many national monuments exist today because originally people wanted them to become national parks, such as Katahdin and Bears Ears, all of these instances. But Congress didn't agree and Congress didn't make it happen. So then the president went and said, well, I have the power to do this. I'm going to make it a national monument. So there is this confusion of, oh, well, we wanted it to be a national park, but that didn't happen. So we're substituting in national monuments. So that's one aspect that's becoming really confusing. Also, a lot of national parks started as national monuments. And so again, there's more confusion of, okay, so we're taking a national monument, making it a national park. Kind of the concept of what is the purpose of a national monument is really getting confused and lost in this whole process as it's becoming just this substitute or intermediary for becoming a national park. And so it's really important that we consider, okay, a national monument is unique, but how so? And what are those different values and what are those different goals and purposes? But it's understandable that there is confusion based on the past interconnectedness of national monuments and national parks.
Matt, RJ, please feel free to add anything.
Yeah, I would say that the experience we've seen is that national monuments really serve as sort of a gateway drug to becoming national parks. Historically, that has been true. It's sort of, particularly in Maine, this is sort of like the Greens have a long last, as far back as the 80s, many of the leading green organizations and spokesmen for wilderness areas and so on set their sights on nationalizing all of the North Main woods. Famous environmentalist at one time was quoted as saying, let's take it all and get it all. And with the creation of this Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument, it's the nose of the camel under the tent. It's like a cancer cell that has been dropped into the North Main woods, and the government will begin to complain that there's too much noise from outside, or there's hunting outside, bullets are coming into the area. snowmobiles are making too much noise, so we need a buffer against this, we need a buffer against that, we have to zone this. And somebody else, another wealthy lefty like Mrs. Quimby, by the way, don't buy Burt's Bees products. I guess she's not involved with it anymore, but nevertheless, I would argue don't do that. That's how she made her $500 million. But somebody else will give another section of land, say 10 miles away or 20 miles away, and then the government will come up with this problem. Oh, there's no way we can manage these two separate areas. We have to get some sort of connecting corridor between the two. And the federal government, particularly the National Park Service, are very clever and very efficient at turning private landowners into willing sellers and making them decide that the one thing they want to do most with their land is sell it to the government at a huge loss to expand these areas. And pretty soon you've essentially nationalized the North Main Woods.
I'll just add, especially in the West, we love our national parks. I feel so blessed because I live so close to so many. But we want to say in what happens with them. And when you have this gateway drug of national monuments, we don't get to start at the conversation from the ground up. And that's the real problem. It's not that we don't want national parks, but we just want to be a part of the process and have our say and have them tailored to meet the unique needs of the people who live in these areas. With these national monument designations, it's a president with a phone and a pen putting a designation on an area, not really looking into the unique needs of that area and what the unique objects need for protection. And that's what it comes down to. So again, it's not a question of our dedication or love for our national parks. It's just wanting to be involved in the process.
Picking up on that theme, I think that was something very apparent in the previous panel is the process just isn't transparent. The people who are most impacted by these lands are some of the last people to be brought into the process. And so we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but as part of reforms or maybe entirely repeal of the Antiquities Act, I wonder what you all have to say about how do we fix the process of national monument designation?
I'll go.
Yes, that was for all of you.
What I'd like to see with the Antiquities Act is an open and transparent process where all parties are involved. That includes environmentalists, that includes recreationists, mineral extractionists, logging grazers, you name it, people who are impacted by the monument. And unfortunately, as it currently is constituted, that doesn't happen. What I'd like to see is eventually get to the point where a president can't either create a national monument or even reduce a national monument in size without consulting local people, without getting approval from the state legislature of the state where the monument resides and Congress. That's what I would like to see. I think it's just logical and it makes sense. It's the way we've done it in America for so long. It's the American democratic process. It's produced principled legislation for hundreds of years in this country. And why is land management an exception to that? Unfortunately, it is under the Antiquities Act. So really, it should require approval by the state legislature and Congress. And then as far as the management plan goes, locals should be involved with that. Local tribes should be engaged in helping to manage the area of Bears Ears, and county commissioners should be involved in a wide board of stakeholders in the actual management plan. So there's just a few ideas I see for reforming the Antiquities Act. I do think, I respect what you say about not being able to, but I do think that we can. I love our national monuments. I went out to Dinosaur National Monument as a kid and got to see the dinosaur tracks and all the neat fossils and everything out in the Uinta Basin in Utah. It's part of who I am, and I do want to preserve those things. So allowing national monuments to continue is fine, but process is important in this country.
I'll follow up on a lot of what Matt said as well. At PERC, we've been thinking a lot about what are some ways to actually reform the management of these lands so that you do see the local input, and we can appreciate that, there are a lot of interests on these lands. There's, timber, traditional grazing, local ranching communities. There are recreationists. There's a lot of people who have interests in these lands. So how do you kind of allow those voices to come together in cooperation rather than the current political conflict that's facing them? So a few ideas that we've been discussing at PERC are how do you, maybe some sort of trust management. Is there a way for these lands to be managed through, a trust board, similar to museums or other groups do right now? You'd be able to have some local representatives, local politicians, federal oversight, as these are federal lands, tribes. Bears Ears right now, there was the huge promise of tribes are going to be actively involved. We're preserving these tribal antiquities. And yet the tribes have just been kind of pushed off to an advisory board position. There's no actual authority in that. It's just advising. So are there ways that we could actually engage in this tribal co-management and achieve the purpose of these lands, of preserving these antiquities and meeting all of these other needs, by bringing those voices together and saying, all right, you're taking an active role in management right now, rather than, kind of sitting on the political sidelines and lobbying or petitioning for this, that, or whatever. Here's your chance. Come together, find these balances, and let's make it happen in a way that all of these voices can be heard, in a way that we cooperate rather than just continue to fight.
I think, Hannah, that's one thing PERC does very well in exploring alternative options, because I think a lot of our land management laws and policies create this system of winners and losers and very little opportunity to explore creative options within that. So I would echo
Thank you.
that kind of perspective. Another thing you all have brought up is there's different kinds of land, different ways to use it, multi-use lands. And I think obviously our national parks are a different category of land, but a lot of these national monument lands were originally multi-use lands. And Matt, if you could start, does a national monument guarantee access, especially for the local communities who've been using these lands for decades and generations?
Yeah, sometimes they can, but other times they can't. I want to give a great story, a great case study of where this happens. So, back in 1996, when President Bill Clinton designated the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, in his proclamation, there was a guarantee, and I quote, that grazing will remain at historical levels. Grazing is so important to the people of Garfield and King County. It's more than just their livelihood, it's their culture. These people moved into the area in the mid-1800s as they moved west and they began cattle ranching, and it's part of who they are. They wake up in the morning, they teach their kids about this. Their lives center on feeding and taking care of their cattle. Well, it's just been 20 years since we got the designation of the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, and grazing's actually declined by almost a third in the monument. Now, more importantly, for the ranchers that do remain, they face an uphill battle. It's hard to move water lines. Juniper trees are starting to encroach, and they can't take out the juniper trees and open up lands for grasses to grow and to ranch. They're having trouble, repairing and building fences, and so it's becoming increasingly difficult. And what that results in, again, going to back what Boyd was talking about, is it results in consequences to people. I mean, like I said, this community depends on ranching so much, and the ranchers have been pushed off the range with their cattle. And in fact, the high school enrollment at Escalante High School is down 67% since 1996. And the county was forced to declare an economic and scholastic state of emergency because of this decline. And so, well, they can. It really comes down to what federal land managers, on-ground people are deciding. And without Congress to set things into law, there's a lot of discretion left up to what they choose to do, and that's a serious problem.
RJ or Hannah?
Well, as a hardcore believer in the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and property, and a free society, I tend to put my faith in private ownership of land and private provision of recreational opportunities and activities rather than turning to government. I think we have to look at the fact that few people look at today, and is seldom mentioned. Every time you go to a congressional hearing and they talk about expanding this or buying this or creating a new national wildlife refuge or enlarging a national park or putting in a buffer zone here or something like this, nobody ever talks about how much is enough, how much federal land is enough. When does the government own so much that the very basis, the very structure on which a free society is built begins to vanish? I mean, we don't even know how much land is owned by government in this country at all levels, federal, state, county, and local. It's definitely well over 40% of all the land and possibly over 50. There are a number of people who think it's over 50. It's very hard to get the figures. We've tried in the past. We've had Congress ask the Library of Congress and GAO and so on to do these studies, and they say, oh, it'll take too long and cost too much. We need somebody like Senator Lee to demand that they come up with this data because it's very hard to get some of the data from the counties. So often the counties don't even know how much they own. But if you're at that point and still growing, I mean, I asked once, I was testifying in the Senate, and Senator Landrieu was there, and I mentioned this figure that we're approaching 50%. I said, how much do you want? Do you want 60%? You want 70%? I mean, what's the purpose of all of this? And then I look at things like the North Main Woods, where you have private working forests providing jobs, maintaining communities and so on, and finding ways to work to make these things operate for the public essentially as a national park and a great recreation area. You can do all these things, and you can do them for a small fee, plus the area itself is providing money, is providing taxes to the communities and so on, instead of sucking in, instead of taking money, instead of taking taxes. And so I would much rather see us explore more opportunities on how we can do these things without the federal government continuing to take more and to lock up more and to control more, because there's always this ability. They quickly forget whatever they wanted to do. I mean, with the Grand Staircase Escalante, in locking up the Kaparowitz coal deposits, nobody even talked about the fact that this was in 1996. In 1967, at the huge battle that went on, one of the most vicious environmental battles we ever had, was over whether we should put any more dams on the Grand Canyon, on the Colorado River. And this was David Brower of the Sierra Club was running his full-page ads in the New York Times and the Washington Post. You know, should we flood the Sistine Chapel so the tourists can get closer to the ceiling to see Michelangelo's paintings? And finally, they came to agreement with President Lyndon Johnson and Secretary of Interior Stuart Udall and David Brower himself that we didn't need any more dams on the Colorado because America's energy future was just a short number of miles away in the Kaparowitz coal, where there was enough clean coal to last the nation for centuries. And yet that was totally forgotten when suddenly President Clinton and Babbitt and Podesta came up with this idea, well, let's lock all this up, and that will certainly please the environmentalists. And I don't see any way to prevent those things from happening over and over and over. I would rather explore ways to have private provision of these kind of recreational opportunities.
I think to your point, RJ, there's a lot of federal land, and the Trump administration has at least promised, we're not interested in increasing the footprint of the federal state, but I think we do need to take a serious look at. We're having a hard time managing what we own already, and I think the national monuments exacerbate those management issues that the Department of Interior is facing some serious budgeting issues associated with that management. So if you all have any thoughts on just, if we care about our national monuments, if we care about our federal lands, we need to be able to manage them well. And I'm not entirely sure where you are facing
even PERC has pointed out in their studies that Don Leal did, you compare federal ownership of forests, state ownership of forests, and private ownership of forests, and the further away you get from federal, the better off the environmental condition the forests are, and the better they're run, the less they burn down, and they actually make money. Instead of losing money and burning down, they make money and stay healthy. And I think there's you can't say much more than that.
Ann or Matt, do you have any comments on just the management side of all of this?
Yeah. as has been mentioned, PERC's done kind of a lot of work on comparing different management structures. And I think even on our federal lands, with the existing estate, there are a lot of ways to kind of harness these market forces or private entities to improve management. For example, let's look at public-private partnerships of managing some of our lands. Over like a half of all Forest Service campgrounds are managed by some private entities, and I don't think there's anything wrong with if we're still providing the same goods, it's still the federal public lands. Is there anything wrong with with contracting with private groups that are able to provide a really great service to enhance our experience on those public lands, such as cleaning bathrooms or even maintaining roads? The people I've talked to, you don't notice any difference between there's no big sign saying this campground is managed by a private entity. You still maintain the same user and visitor experience while able to harness some of those kind of private expertise areas to improve the overall visitor experience.
Amen.
I have one more question, but I want to open it up to the audience for any questions before I finish this up. Got down here. Hold on just a second. A microphone's coming your way. And yes, thank you for introducing yourself.
Hi, my name is Bob Vanas. I'm Executive Director of Saving Seafood. Grant Moore's organization, the Atlantic Offshore Lobstermen's Association, is a member of our National Association for Fishing Communities. Back in the early 90s, when I was a Hill staffer, I worked for Barbara Vikanovich and then covered public lands issues for the Republican Study Committee. And everything that Senator Lee said in his speech today struck me as it was bringing back memories of papers that I wrote back then. There were frequently accusations of coastal liberals, managing public lands in the West. I think President Bush turned the tables on that when a Texas Republican declared Papamano'ohukuakea in Hawaii and went marching into Democratic areas. And Kitty Simons from Westpac has always used to say, if they ever try to do this in the Northeast, there'll be holy hell to pay. Well, Grant described, we went through going to meetings at the White House where we were either lied to or pretty much ignored. We started to realize we were only going to those meetings so they could say that they had lots of meetings when they actually did what they wanted to do. I'm kind of curious, we've kind of stayed out of politics, even the speeches by the chairman and the senator, but I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are now that we do have a situation where, as Kitty predicted, going into the Northeast where you have many states with many members of Congress and many Democrats, it's kind of changed the equation a little bit. Even Senator Elizabeth Warren has publicly said that she thinks that even inside national monuments, fisheries should be managed by the Magnuson-Stevens Act. So I'm curious what you all think, given the fact that we now do finally have not just a situation of coastal liberals marching into central Republican areas. We actually do have a situation where both Republicans and Democratic presidents have gone marching into traditionally Democratic areas and infuriated folks in Maine and in New England. I'm kind of curious what you think the political dynamic is and how that might be able to be used to either allow economic interests to continue in these areas or repeal the act entirely.
First off, I don't know how you pronounce that Hawaiian National Monument.
You must have done a lot of practice on
Wow.
Northwest Hawaiian Islands is what I call it.
I think Boyd hit on it. No one, if you have any federal land in your state, no one is exempt from the Antiquities Act. We talk about it so much in the West because we have a lot, but y'all in the East, you experienced it too, and it's unfortunate. And I hope it's a wake up call. This is about principle too. It's of course, like as we've talked about, it's land, it impacts people, but it really comes down to what is our country about? Are we about those impacted by decisions having a say? Is this about federalism and the ability for states to have their sovereignty and their rights underneath the Constitution? What's it about? And so I hope it is a wake-up call, and I think it is. The fact that we're holding this event here would indicate to me that we're starting to see people wake up and realize that this is a big issue. And of course, Heritage has been, big on this issue for a while, but that we've gotten people from a whole bunch of places together for the first time. When we've done national monument events or discussions, It's just been Western states. And so I think it's fascinating and encouraging to see also here. So I do think the political climate is right for Antiquities Act reform. And I think that we should be joined by people from both sides of the aisle. If you don't like executive overreach, join with us. Let's fix it.
I'll echo a lot of what Matt said as well. I think this is a really interesting time in seeing, it's really easy to support someone having power when you support what they're doing with that power. But seeing now how the same power can be applied, from a different perspective. There has been a time now universally where I can safely say probably everyone, no matter what side of the fence you're on, thinks that's what's happening with the Antiquities Act is wrong. And so we're suddenly seeing people realize like, okay, maybe this is a power overreach. Maybe the president shouldn't be able to just use, a pen and his signature and make some phone calls and affect all of these decisions that affect the lands that affect all of us. So I think this is a great time for people on all sides of the aisle to come together and say, okay, maybe we need to be a little more careful in how we distribute power to decide what happens on our lands.
RJ, any thoughts? Or
Well, I'm not one who shares the view that many do that the national parks were America's best idea, which is bandied about quite a bit in the famous TV series. I think freedom is America's best idea, and we're often looking at the wrong thing. I mean, everybody thought, going back to Hayek in his Road to Serfdom, everybody thought socialism would come to America through a socialist economic system. We're slowly socializing the economy, and I think it's turning out that socialism is coming to America through government land ownership. Paving the road to serfdom with little green bricks instead of little red books, but ending up in the same place.
any other questions from the audience? Okay, I have one more question, and it's in reference to Secretary Zinke's review of the most recent national monuments, which is a refreshing change, from the past 8, 10, 20 years. So I wonder what you all think of the review, what you would like to see happen next now that Secretary Zinke has delivered recommendations to President Trump.
Well, I think the review is the first timid step in following the directions that President Trump gave. I mean, President Trump was very strong in his executive order. He said that this is a usurpation and egregious misuse of federal power, and it never should have happened. And he directed Secretary Zinke to return this power to the people, the ownership of the land and the use of the land, and making the decision on how it is to be used. And so I hope that that President Trump will keep his promise, the promise he made to see that this is rectified, and will tell Secretary Zinke that he's on the right trail. He recognizes that there are problems, but he needs to do an awful lot more.
I'll say I think that this review process is a good, kind of first step for even bringing these monument issues to light. Suddenly, as Matt said, suddenly we're having an event about this, and that's something that honestly I didn't think would be happening even a year ago. But I think also all of this continues to show kind of that our public lands are a bit of a political pawn, per se, of, ultimately the decisions governing these lands are about politics. It's not necessarily about best management or the benefit of the people to whom, in theory at least, these lands belong. And so I really want to see this lead to not just a question of should these be monuments, should these not be monuments, is there the power, but instead have this turn to a discussion more about what are the innovative solutions, what are the purposes of these lands, and then what are ways that we can we can make that happen in a way that, you know, kind of reduces the political oversight and the political games that happen with it. How do you involve that local management? How do you involve those multiple interest groups? And ultimately, how do you make these things, how do you make these lands actually work for the people that have the interest in them?
I agree completely. You know, this review is a welcome sign for community across the country, specifically as we've talked about those in the West. And really, what it's done is it's opened up opportunities to talk about land management and talk about what does tribal co-management look like. I know that Perk and Sutherland work on a project together on that, and so it allows us to do that. But I hope we get to take it a step further from what the Trump administration's doing. I hope it spurs Congress to action. It's their responsibility to govern and make decisions for our public lands. They're elected by us. You know, when you have a whole host of individuals from all around the country working together, there's no limit to what we can accomplish. So I hope it goes a step further and that we get some real democratic solutions through our elected representatives as well.
With that, unless there are any other questions. All right. Thank you very much for your thoughts today, and thank you for the rest of our panels this morning for the Sutherland Institute partnering with us to host this event, and thank you to our audience online and here today for your attention. Have a good rest of the afternoon.